Josh Frydenberg, welcome.
Nice to be with you, Chris.
Now, another interim report from the Australian energy market operator is out on the events of the 28th of September in South Australia. What does that tell us about the blackout of that entire state?
Well, this is an important report because more information is coming to hand for the Australian energy market operator to piece together exactly what happened on that night of the 28th of September when 1.7 million people lost power in their homes, in their businesses, and of course across the state. What we have been told today by AEMO is that at the time of the blackout there was 1,900 megawatts of power being distributed across South Australia. About 50% of that was coming from wind, about 30% was coming from the interconnector from Victoria, which is brown coal-fired power coming into South Australia, and the rest was coming from gas, about 20% from gas. And as a result of the storm activity, transmission towers were knocked down. And as a result of those transmission towers going down, there were what is called voltage disturbances across the grid. And this led to 9 out of the 13 wind farms shutting down because of the particular settings on those wind farms.
But that was unexpected. The generator did expect that those wind farms would ride through this event, as the thermal power stations did.
Well, that's an important point because the thermal power stations, and there were 2 of those in South Australia, they rode through this event despite those voltage disturbances, and that's the difference between intermittent power, namely wind and solar, and the gas-fired power, which is more baseload sources of power, or it could be coal or it could be gas. So as a result of those storm occurrences, transmission towers going down, we did find that 9 of those 13 wind farms did no longer produce power. And as a result, that led to a surge, Chris, across the system, which meant there was increased demand across the interconnector, and the interconnector couldn't cope with that demand, so the interconnector shut itself down, and suddenly South Australia was without power across the state.
And that's the point at which the thermal power stations are snuffed out, because South Australia then can't control the frequency within the state because all of the stabilisation is coming from Victoria. So what does this event tell us about the state of the electricity market, first of all in South Australia?
Well, it tells us that there are real difficulties in integrating the renewable sources, particularly wind and solar, into the grid. It's just a challenge because they don't have the characteristics that the baseload power, whether it's hydro, whether it's gas or coal, can provide. Now, over time that may be overcome, but right now there are real difficulties because it doesn't produce a consistent quality of generation or a consistent quantity of generation. And we've been told by AEMO these are the challenges that it faces. Now, in South Australia, the Premier tells us that he had a big experiment going, more than 41% of the power being generated from intermittent sources, namely wind and solar. Well, that experiment failed in South Australia. And now all energy ministers in other states are on notice that they have to reform their systems, that they can't pursue unrealistic state-based targets, and that they have to proceed very carefully to ensure that the light stays on and that there are stable systems.
So are you making an argument against renewable energy?
No, not at all, because this government strongly supports our 23.5% renewable energy target by 2020. Currently, Australia gets about 15% of its power from renewable sources. So to get to 23.5% will be a stretch, but we're determined to get there. And as you know, we have a number of mechanisms in place to support that policy. What I am against is the states pursuing unilateral action, unrealistic targets, 50% renewables in South Australia, 50% in Queensland, despite them only today having 4.5% of renewable power, 40% in Victoria. This is going to lead to a skewing of investment decisions and will compromise energy security.
But there's no sign that the states are listening to you at all. In fact, they say that you're making an argument for coal.
They don't have to listen to me. They have to listen to their constituents. And their constituents expect that their governments will first and foremost prioritise energy security. Of course, energy affordability is a big issue too, because we know right now generating a megawatt of wind or solar power is going to be a higher cost proposal than either gas or coal. Coal is coming down, and I've said that is a good thing in this country. But the transition and the timeframes and the way it's done is absolutely critical.
Isn't what we're seeing, though, and South Australia is a good example of this, is the cheapest source of energy, once it starts to be produced, is wind, and then the next cheapest source of energy is brown coal from Victoria. What you're driving out of the marketplace is gas, which should be the transition fuel.
Well, gas must be the transition fuel because it's half the emissions of coal, and it also has those characteristics that can provide the energy in a consistent manner 24/7. Now, we at COAG, through the energy ministers, have agreed on a whole suite of domestic gas reforms so that we can actually increase supply and get it at a lower price, because if it gets down to a lower price, then it can compete with the other forms.
Isn't part of the problem in all of this if we had a national carbon price which was making an orderly transition away from the old coal-fired power plants and to renewable energy? This would be progressing much better than it is now. We have a hodgepodge of systems that's taking its place.
Well, that's not dealing with the real issue at hand, which is intermittent power doesn't have the characteristics which stabilises the system as coal or gas, or dare I say it, a renewable like hydro does. Because if there's water in the dam, power can be generated. Now, we have to account for those challenges in the system and the integration. We can do it over time, and I'm very hopeful about battery storage, for example. I think if battery storage can develop in the way we hope over the coming years, then that may help solve a lot of these engineering problems. But right now, we're not there.
Isn't the truth that people will find out is the transition actually is expensive? We've already seen the wholesale prices go up. Eventually, and particularly in South Australia, that will be transmitted to retail electricity prices in South Australia.
Well, you've seen in South Australia in July of this year, when the wholesale price of electricity went in the one day from $100 a megawatt hour to $14,000 a megawatt hour. Now, that was a result of a number of things, including an upgrade to the interconnector, but also it was due to the intermittent nature of energy supply. You see, in one day in June, wind was supplying 80% of South Australia's energy needs, and another day in July it was supplying just 1%. And it's that level of variability which we can't control, which does create problems for price.
And finally, isn't that the inconvenient truth that politicians, even like yourself, are going to have to come to terms with, because you've got a 23.5% target, is that we can get to renewable energy and it's inevitable in our power system, but it's going to be more expensive.
It is more expensive over time, there's no secret to that. And we know, for example, that the federal opposition, Bill Shorten, has a 50% target by 2030 of renewable energy. And we've heard from the Bloomberg Energy Finance Corporation, company, that will lead to a cost of at least $48 billion. Where is that money coming from? It's not in their budget figures. They're the questions that they have to answer.
Josh Rodberg will have to ask them another day. Thank you.
Nice to be with you, Chris.